The diner sat on the edge of a forgotten highway, the kind of place that had been there long before the freeway took most of the traffic away. Its neon sign flickered in the dark, buzzing against the silence of the night. Inside, the hum of an old radio filled the space, country music playing low over the clinking of coffee cups and the quiet chatter of regulars. Laura Hastings sat in the corner booth, back to the wall, eyes scanning the room without looking like she was. Old habits died hard, her hands scarred but steady, wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the steam curling in lazy spirals above it. She didn't come here for conversation. She came here for silence, for routine, for the comfort of something that didn't change. A book lay open on the table, something she had read a dozen times before, but she wasn't really reading. She was watching, listening, calculating, because even in the quietest places, danger had a way of finding her, and tonight was no different. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the stillness, cutting through the night like a blade. The headlights swung through the windows, throwing long shadows across the diner floor. Conversation stopped. Rachel, the young waitress, paused mid-step, her grip tightening on the coffee pot. Laura sighed, setting her cup down. Trouble had arrived. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here. And before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story." The door swung open and the biker gang poured in like they owned the place. There were 5 of them, leather jackets, heavy boots, the stink of gasoline and arrogance clinging to them. They moved like men who had never been told no, like the world belonged to them. The leader, a tall, wiry guy with snake tattoos coiling up his neck, sauntered in first. His smirk was lazy, but his eyes were sharp, always looking for something to sink his teeth into. The other patrons lowered their heads, pretending not to notice. That was how it always went. Let the wolves pass through, don't make eye contact, don't give them a reason to stop. But Laura didn't lower her head. She kept reading, and that's why they noticed her. Snake grinned, nudging the guy beside him. "Well, look at this," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Lady sitting all alone. That don't seem right, does it?" The others chuckled, already circling, like predators testing the air. Laura didn't react. She turned the page in her book. Rachel swallowed hard, stepping closer. I can take your orders." Snake held up a hand, cutting her off. "Hold up, sweetheart. We'll get to you in a second." His grin widened as he leaned on the edge of Laura's booth. "I'm talking to the lady first." Laura exhaled slowly through her nose. Rachel glanced at her, nervous. "Ma'am?" she asked softly. Laura finally looked up. Her gaze settled on Snake, her eyes cold, unreadable. "Go help your other customers, Rachel," she said, her voice steady. Snake let out a mocking chuckle, nudging the biker next to him. "Oh, we got ourselves a tough one." The others closed in a little more, their postures relaxed, but their hands twitching, ready. Laura could already see how this would play out. They were testing her, seeing if she'd flinch, if she'd fold under the weight of their presence. They thought she was just some woman sitting alone, easy pickings. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Snake reached for the book on the table, his fingers grazing the edge. "What's so interesting, huh?" Laura moved fast. Before he could blink, her hand shot out, wrapping around his wrist like a steel vice. The laughter died instantly. Snake froze, his arm locked in place. His grin faltered, twisting into something uncertain. Laura squeezed just enough for him to feel it. Not pain, not yet, just a warning. Her voice was calm, quiet, but sharp as a blade. "Take your hand off my table." For a second, no one moved. Then Snake yanked his arm back, stumbling a step, covering it with a forced laugh. "Damn, lady," he muttered, shaking out his wrist. "That's one hell of a grip." One of the younger bikers snorted. "Maybe she's got some fight in her after all." Snake's smile returned, but it was different now, tighter. He had just lost control of the situation, and he knew it. And that meant he had 2 choices, back off or escalate. Laura could already tell which one he was going to pick. Snake lunged, reaching for her. Maybe to grab her, maybe just to make a point. It didn't matter. Laura moved first. She caught his wrist again, but this time, she twisted. Snake let out a strangled grunt, his knees buckling as she bent his arm at an unnatural angle, forcing him down against the table. His cheek slammed into the wood, his free hand scrambling for balance. The other bikers snapped to attention, their hands going for their belts, knives, maybe even a gun. Laura's voice cut through the tension like a razor. "Don't!" They froze. She twisted Snake's arm just a little more, enough for his breath to hitch in pain. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone flat, unshaken. Snake struggled, but he wasn't getting loose. "Jesus Christ, lady," he gasped. "Let go." Laura stared down at him for a long second, then finally released him. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm, his breath ragged, his face flushed with humiliation. The other bikers hesitated. Rachel was staring, her eyes wide. The entire diner was silent, holding its breath. Laura picked up her coffee, took a slow sip. Then she met Snake's eyes. "Leave," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it left no room for argument. The bikers didn't move. They were caught in that moment, that thin, razor-sharp line between pride and survival. Snake's jaw clenched. His pride was screaming at him to do something, anything. But the smart part of his brain, the part that had just felt how quickly she could put him down, was screaming even louder. Finally, he let out a shaky breath, shaking his head. "This ain't over." Laura didn't blink. "It is for tonight." Snake wiped his mouth, threw one last glare at her, then turned on his heel and pushed out the door. His men followed, slower, reluctant, still processing what just happened. The rumble of their bikes roared to life outside. Then, just like that, they were gone. The silence in the diner stretched long and heavy. Rachel swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "What the hell just happened?" Joe muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "Damn fools just tried to pick a fight with the wrong woman." Laura sighed, setting her coffee cup down. They'll be back. She already knew it. Men like them always came back. And next time, they wouldn't just be looking to scare her, they'd be looking to win. The night stretched long and silent after the bikers roared out of the parking lot. But Laura knew better than to think it was over. It never was. Not with men like that. She had seen their type before, small men trying to look big, thinking the world owed them something just because they had numbers, just because no one ever told them no. She had spent her whole damn life fighting men like that. The diner slowly returned to life, the low murmur of voices picking up again. But it wasn't the same. The weight of what had just happened still clung to the air. People were glancing toward the door, toward the window, as if expecting the gang to come back at any second. Rachel was still clutching a coffee pot behind the counter, her hands white-knuckled around the handle. Joe had muttered something about idiots ruining my damn business before disappearing into the kitchen. Laura exhaled, picked up her coffee, and took another sip. She was calm. She had always been calm, even when bullets were flying overhead, when her boots were covered in sand and blood, when her team was cut down one by one. She had learned to stay still inside. Because when you lose control, you die. Duke, the local mechanic who had been sitting 2 booths over, shook his head and finally spoke. "You know they'll be back, right?" Laura gave him a sideways glance. "I'd be disappointed if they weren't." He let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You sure you can handle this alone?" Laura studied him. Big guy, strong, probably tough in his own right. But there was something else in his expression. Not fear exactly, but the kind of concern that came from someone who had seen what real violence looked like. She nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." Duke exhaled through his nose. He didn't push it, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. The diner's neon lights buzzed faintly, the only sound in the lull between conversations. Then, the unmistakable rumble of engines echoed through the night. Rachel visibly tensed. Joe peeked his head out from the kitchen, his face pale. "Oh, for the love of..." Laura set down her coffee. "Stay inside," she said. Rachel blinked. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" Laura stood up. The chair scraped against the floor as she moved, her motions slow, deliberate. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the familiar tension in her muscles. The glass windows trembled slightly as the bikes pulled back into the lot, more than before. She counted at least 10. They had brought backup. The roar of engines cut off one by one, leaving the air thick and heavy with expectation. Laura walked to the door. Joe muttered a curse. Rachel grabbed her arm. "Don't go out there," she said, voice tight. "They're gonna..." Laura gently removed her hand. They won't do anything yet. Rachel stared at her like she was insane. How the hell do you know that? Laura gave her a small smirk. Because if they were here to kill me, they wouldn't have made so much noise coming in. She pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cool night air wrapped around her, and the moment her boots hit the pavement, she felt that old familiar rush. The clarity. The way the world slowed down, right before something bad happened. The bikers were already spreading out, forming a loose semicircle, cutting off any escape route. Their headlights burned into the night, casting long, jagged shadows. Snake stood in the middle, his arm still stiff from where she had twisted it. His lip was split, swollen. He must have bitten down too hard when she slammed him against the table. And beside him, a new face. Bigger, meaner, a shaved head, thick arms covered in faded tattoos, scars along his knuckles from years of breaking them against people's faces. Snake grinned, but it wasn't cocky anymore. It was ugly, bitter. You really should have stayed inside, lady. Laura stopped just short of them, her stance relaxed but ready. You're back sooner than I expected, she said. What happened? Couldn't stand getting beaten by a woman? A couple of the bikers chuckled, but they were quickly silenced by the shaved head man stepping forward. You think you're funny? He asked, his voice a low growl. Laura looked at him, assessing. This wasn't some punk like Snake. This was someone who had been in real fights, real wars. She met his eyes and smiled just a little. Not really, she said. I just like watching men like you get embarrassed. The tension in the air snapped tight like a wire about to break. The shaved head man exhaled through his nose. Name's Brick, he said, and you just made a big mistake. Laura tilted her head. Oh? Brick smirked. Yeah, because this time, we're not just here to scare you. The other bikers shifted, cracking knuckles, stretching their necks. Laura exhaled. She wasn't afraid. She was disappointed. They really thought they had a chance. Brick took another step forward, rolling his shoulders. You got two choices, lady. Get on your knees and apologize, or... Laura didn't let him finish. She moved first. Her boot shot forward, fast and brutal, slamming straight into Brick's knee. The crack echoed through the night. Brick let out a choked yell, his leg buckling as he collapsed sideways. Before the others could react, Laura was already moving. She grabbed the nearest biker by the collar of his jacket, twisting and driving her elbow straight into his throat. He crumpled, choking. Another one lunged for her. She ducked under his swing, grabbed his wrist, and twisted, hard. His own momentum sent him spinning, his back slamming into the side of a bike. 3 down in less than 5 seconds. Snake stumbled back, eyes wide. What the? Laura turned to him, unbothered, calm as ever. You really want to finish that sentence? The remaining bikers hesitated, suddenly unsure. Brick was still groaning on the ground, clutching his knee. Snake's confidence shattered. Laura cracked her knuckles. Here's what's gonna happen, she said, her voice even, steady. You're going to get on your bikes and you're going to leave. And if I ever see you in this town again... She let the silence hang for just a second before stepping closer, her gaze locked onto Snake's. You won't be leaving in one piece. No one moved, then Snake finally snapped out of it. Get on the damn bikes, he muttered, voice shaking. The remaining bikers scrambled, helping Brick to his feet, dragging him toward his ride. Within seconds, the engines were roaring again, this time in retreat. Laura watched them go. When the last taillight disappeared into the night, she exhaled, rolled her shoulders, and walked back inside. Rachel was still frozen behind the counter. Joe was standing there, mouth slightly open. Laura sat back in her booth, picked up her coffee, and took a slow sip. Like I said, she murmured, they weren't ready. The air in the diner was thick with silence. It wasn't the usual small-town quiet, the kind where the only noise was the hum of a neon sign and the occasional scrape of a fork against a plate. No, this was the silence that followed violence, the kind that came when people had just witnessed something they weren't sure they believed. Laura sat back down in her booth, her coffee still warm in her hands. She could feel Rachel's wide-eyed stare from behind the counter, Joe standing with his arms crossed, his mouth pressed into a tight line. Duke, the mechanic who had been watching since the beginning, let out a slow whistle from the bar. Damn, he muttered, shaking his head. You didn't just beat him, you broke him? Laura didn't respond. She just took another sip, savoring the heat. Rachel finally found her voice. "They're coming back, aren't they?" Laura exhaled through her nose, setting her cup down. "Probably." Joe let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. "Of course they are. Jesus, Laura, couldn't you have just let it go?" Laura's eyes flicked to him, cool and steady. "Let it go?" She leaned forward slightly. "If you roll over for dogs like that, they don't walk away. They come back hungrier." Joe muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. They all did. Outside, the desert stretched wide and empty. But Laura knew those bikers weren't gone for good. She had seen the look in Snake's eyes before, the kind of man who had been humiliated in front of his crew. And that kind of wound didn't heal with distance. It festered. He'd come back. But this time, he wouldn't be looking to prove a point. This time, he'd be looking to make an example. The minutes stretched, slow and heavy. The regulars finished their meals quickly, throwing cash onto the counter and slipping out into the night, their shoulders tight with tension. They didn't want to be here when round 2 started. Rachel hesitated, her hands twisting in her apron. "Maybe we should close early," she said, voice uncertain. Joe sighed. "We never close early." But even as he said it, he walked over to the door and locked it. Duke set his empty coffee cup down and rolled his shoulders. "So what's the plan, Iron?" Laura's fingers curled slightly at the old nickname. She hadn't heard it in years, but it still fit. She exhaled, pushing back from the booth. "We get ready." Joe frowned. "For what?" Laura's gaze drifted to the window. "For war." The bikers came back faster than even Laura expected. Maybe it was Snake's wounded ego, or maybe he had backup waiting all along, but less than 20 minutes later, the roar of engines split the night again. Joe cursed under his breath. "Damn it, I just replaced the damn windows last summer." Rachel backed toward the kitchen, her breath coming fast. "What do we do? Call the cops?" Joe let out a humorless laugh. "Honey, by the time the sheriff gets here, there won't be anything left but bullet holes." Laura stood, rolling the tension out of her shoulders. Duke followed her lead, cracking his knuckles. "I count 12 engines this time." Laura nodded. "More than before. Good." Rachel blinked. "Good?" Duke smirked. "Means they're serious. And when people like them get serious, they make mistakes." The first set of headlights swept across the windows, casting long shadows across the walls. The motorcycles came in first, lining up in a tight formation, their riders sitting tall, ready for blood. Then came the truck, a matte black monster of a machine, rolling in slow, deliberate. Its tinted windows hid whatever was inside, but Laura already knew. Snake had called in the real muscle. The bikes cut off one by one, engines dying into an eerie silence. Then, the truck shut off last. The diner felt small now, too small for the fight that was about to happen. The door to the truck opened, and Brick stepped out first. His knee was still stiff from the kick Laura had landed earlier, but he walked like a man who didn't care about pain, or like a man who was used to it. Snake followed behind him, his lip curled in a mix of rage and excitement. Laura stepped outside before they had the chance to try and rip the door off its hinges. She stood calm, unshaken, her boots planted firmly in the dirt. Snake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You got some balls, lady." Laura tilted her head. "Thought we already established that." Brick's fingers flexed at his sides. "You got lucky before." Laura smirked. "I don't believe in luck." Snake's face darkened. "Well then, you're about to believe in something a hell of a lot worse." He took a step forward, his voice dropping. "You don't walk away from this one, Iron." Laura's expression didn't change. "Neither do you." Behind her, the diner door swung open and Duke stepped out, followed by Joe, who was holding a baseball bat like he actually meant to use it. Snake's crew shifted uneasily. They had come expecting fear. They hadn't expected a fight. But Snake wasn't backing down this time. He flicked his fingers, a sharp, wordless command. 2 of his men rushed forward first, their movements fast and aggressive. Laura moved faster. She sidestepped the first one, grabbed the back of his jacket, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the hood of a nearby bike. The second threw a wild punch, but Laura ducked low and drove an elbow into his ribs, making him collapse with a sharp gasp. Brick rushed in next, but this time, Duke was waiting. The former mechanic was built like a boulder, and when Brick swung, Duke absorbed the hit and countered with a right hook that sent him sprawling. Joe took a bat to the shin of another biker, and the guy went down hard, cursing. Snake watched it all, his face twisting in fury. He yanked a knife from his belt and lunged straight for Laura. She saw it coming, and she let him get just close enough before she moved. At the last second, she caught his wrist, twisted hard, and turned his own blade against him. The knife clattered to the pavement as she spun him around, wrenching his arm behind his back. He screamed in frustration, struggling, but she didn't let go. Instead, she leaned in, her voice low and cold in his ear. "You came here to win," she murmured, "but you never even knew what the fight was." Then she let go and shoved him forward. Snake stumbled, caught himself, and whirled around, but he didn't attack again. He just stood there, chest heaving, face flushed with rage and humiliation. Laura didn't speak. She just waited. And then, finally, Snake's pride broke. He turned to his men. "We're done." Brick groaned, struggling to his feet, but Snake was already walking toward his bike. One by one, the others followed. Laura watched them go. And when the last headlight disappeared, she let out a slow breath. Duke cracked his neck. "You think they'll come back?" Laura smirked. "Not a chance." Inside the diner, the neon sign buzzed softly. She picked up her coffee again, as if nothing had ever happened. The silence after the fight was different from before. It wasn't the tense, waiting kind of quiet that came before a storm. This was the silence after a battle, when the dust settled and the losers limped away, their pride bleeding just as badly as their bodies. Laura took another sip of her coffee, watching the last tail light of the bikers disappear over the horizon. The air still smelled of gasoline, sweat, and bad decisions. She exhaled slowly, placing the cup down with careful precision. Duke rolled his shoulder, stretching out a muscle that had taken a hit during the brawl. He looked at Laura, his expression caught between amusement and concern. "Well, that was fun," he muttered, flexing his fingers. "I think I cracked one of my knuckles on Brick's ugly face." Joe, still gripping the baseball bat in his hand, let out a breath and leaned it against the counter. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "They're gone, right? This time for real?" Laura didn't answer immediately. She could still feel the adrenaline humming through her veins. But more than that, she felt the unfinished weight of something still hanging in the air. Snake had backed down, but men like him never truly let things go. She exhaled, shaking her head. "No," she said simply. "They'll be back." Rachel, who had cautiously stepped out from behind the counter, flinched at those words. "What?" After that, they got their asses handed to them. Laura turned to her, eyes sharp. "And that's exactly why they'll be back." Duke ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, frowning. "Damn right. A guy like Snake? He's not just angry, he's embarrassed. You took him apart in front of his crew, twice. He won't let that slide." Joe let out a groan and rubbed his temples. "Of course not. That would be too easy." Laura wasn't worried about Snake. She had dealt with men like him before, men whose biggest weakness was their ego. No, what concerned her was Brick. He had been slow to act in the fight, waiting, watching. He wasn't just muscle. He had been calculating, trying to figure out what kind of threat she was. Snake might have run his mouth, but Brick was the one who would come back with a plan. She turned to Duke. "How many guys do you know around town who could stand their ground?" Duke narrowed his eyes, rubbing his chin. "I got a couple of guys from my shop, a few ex-military friends who don't mind stepping into a fight." He met her gaze. "You expecting something big?" Laura glanced out the window at the empty road, her muscles already tensing for what was coming next. "Yeah," she said, "I am." Snake didn't stop driving until his knuckles turned white on the handlebars. His crew was silent behind him, the weight of their second humiliation pressing down on them like a damn anvil. He could barely process it. That woman had destroyed them. It wasn't just that she had fought back, it was the way she had done it. Effortless, precise, like she had seen it all before, like she had done worse things to worse men. His stomach twisted with rage and shame. He pulled off the highway near an abandoned lot, skidding to a stop. The others pulled in behind him, their bikes rumbling low in the darkness. The only sound was the ticking of their engines cooling and their ragged breathing as they tried to make sense of what the hell had just happened. Brick stepped off his bike last. He was calm, always calm, but there was a fire in his eyes that made the others uneasy. Snake turned on him, furious. "What the hell, man? That was supposed to be our fight. We had the numbers, we had the..." Brick held up a hand, and Snake shut up. "We didn't have shit," Brick said, his voice low, measured. "And you knew that the second she put you on your back." Snake's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Brick took a step forward. "You think this was just some bar fight, some small-town diner brawl? That woman, she's trained. She's seen real combat." He let the weight of those words settle before continuing. "You don't fight someone like that head-on. You hunt them, you wear them down, you hit them where they're weakest." Snake narrowed his eyes. "You got a plan?" Brick smirked. "Yeah, and this time, we do it my way." The third time the bikes came, they didn't make a lot of noise. They didn't announce themselves with engines roaring and headlights flashing. They came quiet. Laura had been sitting by the window, watching the road, waiting. She had felt it in her bones. The fight wasn't over. And she was right. Rachel had just refilled her coffee when she heard the sound. Not the engines, not this time. It was the shuffle of boots on pavement, the creak of leather. Laura's grip tightened around her mug. "Rachel," she murmured, not looking up. Rachel froze. "What?" "Go in the back," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Rachel hesitated for half a second too long. Then she saw the shadows moving outside. She didn't argue, she ran. Duke was already moving, reaching for something under his jacket. A blade, a weapon, something. Joe muttered a curse under his breath, backing toward the bar. The first window shattered. Glass sprayed across the diner as a brick slammed onto the floor, skidding to a stop by Laura's booth. Then the door burst open. Snake came in first, but this time, he wasn't alone. Brick was right beside him, and behind them, at least 10 men, their faces set, their hands already gripping chains, bats, knives. No more games, no more intimidation. They were here to finish it. Snake's eyes locked onto Laura, burning with fury. "You should have left town when you had the chance." Laura stood up. Her body moved without hesitation, controlled, prepared. She rolled her shoulders, cracked her neck, and smirked. "Funny," she said, her voice like steel. "I was just about to say the same thing." Then the real fight began. The glass from the shattered window crunched beneath Laura's boots as she took a slow step forward, her body calm but coiled, ready for the fight she had seen coming from miles away. The bikers stood in the doorway, filling the diner like a flood, their presence thick with bad intentions. Snake's lip curled as he ran a thumb over his split lip, still swollen from the last time he had tried to challenge her. But this time, he wasn't grinning. This time, he wasn't looking for a laugh. This time, he was here to bury her. Brick stood beside him, the real danger in the room, his eyes cold, assessing, waiting. He wasn't the kind of man who fought for pride or to prove a point. No, Brick was here because he had something to finish, because men like him didn't like leaving loose ends. Laura exhaled, slow and steady. 12 men, weapons, a tight space. This was going to get ugly. Joe had backed up against the bar, muttering curses under his breath as he grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling to dial. But Laura knew the cops wouldn't get here in time. The bikers hadn't come for a fight. They had come for a reckoning. Rachel was gone. That was good. She had listened. Duke stood at Laura's side, his stance low, his body shifting slightly, his weight moving onto the balls of his feet. He wasn't a stranger to this either. He'd been in enough fights to know that this was going to be a war. The air in the diner grew thick, suffocating. No one spoke. Then Brick moved first. He was fast for a man his size, lunging at Laura with the kind of speed that came from experience. But she was faster. She stepped aside, her foot sweeping out, catching his knee just as he shifted his weight. Brick stumbled, just for a second, but that second was all she needed. Laura's elbow drove hard into his ribs, feeling the impact reverberate up her arm. A clean hit. She knew how to break ribs. She knew how to disable a man without needing to kill him. But Brick was tougher than most. He let out a sharp grunt, but didn't go down. His hand shot out, grabbing at her, but Laura was already pivoting, twisting her body to avoid the grip. Then the others rushed in. Duke took the first swing, his fist smashing into the face of the closest biker, sending him sprawling over a booth. The man hit the table hard, flipping it over as coffee and plates shattered onto the floor. Joe, of all people, got one good swing in with a baseball bat, cracking one of the bikers across the arm before being shoved back behind the counter. Laura moved like a storm in the middle of chaos, every punch, every step deliberate, practiced. She ducked low, dodging a swinging chain, then caught the man's arm, twisting it behind his back and driving his face into the counter. His nose cracked against the wood, and he collapsed with a muffled scream. A bat whistled through the air toward her ribs, but she twisted away, grabbing the attacker's wrist and pulling hard, using his own momentum against him. The biker stumbled forward, off balance, and Laura drove a brutal knee into his gut, making him double over with a choking sound. Duke had grabbed another biker by the collar and threw him clean across a booth, the man's back crashing against the wall. For a second, just a second, Laura thought they had this under control. Then she heard the click. Her head snapped toward Snake. He had a gun. She didn't hesitate. Her foot shot out, kicking the nearest metal napkin dispenser off the counter, sending it flying straight into his wrist. The shot went off, but it hit the ceiling. Snake yelled in surprise, shaking out his hand, and Laura was already moving, closing the distance. She grabbed his wrist before he could fire again, twisting it hard. The gun clattered to the floor, and she drove her palm up into his chin, snapping his head back. Snake staggered, his balance lost. Laura grabbed him by the front of his jacket, yanked him forward, and slammed him headfirst into the jukebox. Glass shattered, sparks spit out, and Snake crumpled to the floor, motionless. Brick was still standing. He wiped blood from his mouth, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what was happening. The last of his men were groaning, crawling, trying to pull themselves together. He looked around, then back at Laura. And then he did something unexpected. He smiled, a slow, knowing grin. "Damn," he muttered, breathing hard. "You're something else." Laura just stared at him. "Are we done here?" Brick rolled his shoulders, exhaled through his nose, then slowly nodded. "Yeah," he said. "We're done." He turned, looking at the wreckage of his crew, and let out a short laugh. "Let's go." The bikers didn't argue. One by one, they limped out of the diner, some clutching ribs, others holding their faces. Snake was hauled out last, still dazed. Brick stopped in the doorway, looked back at Laura, and tilted his head. "You ever think about riding with a real crew?" he asked. Laura smirked. "I had one. It was called the United States Army." Brick chuckled. "Figures?" Then he nodded, like he finally understood who she was. "You ever need a favor, you know where to find me." And with that, he was gone. The rumble of engines faded into the night. The diner was a mess. Broken tables, shattered glass, coffee and food splattered across the floor. Joe looked around, exhaled slowly, then muttered, "You better tip big next time, Hastings." Laura finally let herself breathe. Rachel peeked out from the back, eyes still wide with shock. Are we alive?" she whispered. Duke laughed, rubbing his jaw. "Barely." Laura just walked back to her booth, shaking out her hands as she sat down. Her coffee was cold now. She sighed. Rachel still wasn't moving. You just took down an entire biker gang." Laura picked up the coffee cup, swirled it absently. "Yeah," she murmured. "But to be fair, they made it easy." Joe groaned. "Next time you want to start a war, could you do it somewhere else?" Laura smiled faintly. "Not my fault they don't know when to quit." Rachel swallowed hard. "You really think they're done?" Laura looked toward the door, toward the empty night outside. "Yeah," she said. She knew when a fight was over, and this one was. Duke exhaled, shaking his head. "You're buying the drinks after this." Laura chuckled, taking a slow sip of her cold coffee. "Deal." The neon sign buzzed above them, flickering once before settling back into its usual hum. The night moved on, the world kept turning, and Laura Hastings was still standing. The end.